This podcast is part of E2C Network, where we share the whole Auburn experience.
Hello and welcome to War Horses, the only college equestrian podcast that's getting a little frustrated with this whole league schedule nonsense. I'm your host, Auburn Elvis. Let's talk about some college equestrian. We had a ton of action this past weekend, so we're going to get right into some meet recaps. Alright, so first up we have Fresno State at Baylor. This happened on Thursday. I predicted somebody would have to win this. Both teams kind of did their best to not win, but Baylor ended up the winner in a tiebreaker. Baylor won fences 4-1. They won the flat 3-2. Fresno State won horsemanship 3-0 and reining 3-2. This produced a 9-9 tie, and Baylor barely edged them out, 16-13.5 to 16-09.5 in the tiebreaker. So Baylor picked up their first win of the season. For Fresno State, they would get another chance the following day at Oklahoma State. So we'll jump right on over to that one. On Friday, with this, I predicted the Cowgirls would win by 1 million. They ended up winning 12-7. Fences went 4-2 for Oklahoma State. Flat was a 2-2 tie. Horsemanship went 3-2 for OSU. And reining also went 3-2 for the Cowgirls. So this was a nice home win for Oklahoma State. They remain right below TCU in the Big 12 race with this win. For Fresno State, they'll still have one more chance here in the fall. They're going to host SMU in 2 weeks, so we'll see how that meet goes for them. Now, the next meet we'll talk about is Texas A&M at South Carolina. Now, I felt like South Carolina had a shot, but I still predicted A&M would win this by about 3 or 4 points. It ended up being a 10-8 decision. Fences went 3-2 for A&M, and the flat went 3-1 for A&M. Horsemanship went 3-2 for A&M, and reining went 3-1 for South Carolina. This produced that 10-8 final score. There were a lot of close points here. A&M actually had a 0 on one ride. What that means is if one of the head-to-head points had flipped from A&M to South Carolina, then the Gamecocks would have probably won that tiebreaker because of that 0. So this was actually pretty close. But it was a nice road win for the Aggies. They stayed atop the SEC standings along with Auburn, and they're actually going to host the Tigers this week. For South Carolina, they almost got a win, but like I said a couple of episodes back, they're pretty much guaranteed to make it to Ocala with the teams that they've already beaten so far with their schedule. So everything they're doing these days is really just to get better. It's it's house money for them. So, also I will say on the score sheet that South Carolina turned in, there were some blanks in it, so they get some deductions in the Golden Score Sheet competition, which we'll talk about down the road here. Next, we have a whole bunch of meets up in South Dakota. First off, UC Davis versus Minnesota Crookston. Now, I predicted the Aggies would win this by 2 million. It ended up being 19-1. UC Davis won everything. Fences and flat were 5-0 sweeps. Horsemanship was a 5-0 sweep, and reining went 4-1 to the Aggies as well. So, hats off to Minnesota Crookston's Rihanna Danielson, because she defended the Golden Eagles' honor by getting that 1 point there and preventing the total sweep. So, nice win for the Aggies. This was a tough but expected loss for the Eagles here. Also, there were several blanks in the score sheet, so South Dakota State is going to lose some points here and there in the Golden Score Sheet deductions. So, we'll talk about that. Next, we're going to do UC Davis at South Dakota State. I predicted UC Davis would win by about 4 points. It ended up being 14-4, so even more one-sided than I predicted. Davis won fences 3-2. They won flat 5-0, horsemanship 3-1, and reining 3-1. So there were some more blanks in the score sheet, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, no, good win for UC Davis. This was against an ECAC foe. That's what they needed. It was on the road, which is also impressive, so good job to them. Then the final meet up there in the north was Minnesota Crookston at South Dakota State. I predicted the Jackrabbits win this by 1 million. It ended up being 16-2 for South Dakota State. Here's how the events went. The Jackrabbits won fences 5-0. They won the flat 4-0. They won horsemanship 3-1, and they won reining 4-1. And again, there were some more blanks in the score sheet, so more deductions there. So yeah, okay. So good win for South Dakota State. Minnesota Crookston hasn't gotten a win yet, so it isn't the most prestigious win. But hey, it's better than losing. So good job, Jackrabbits. Now we also had a bunch of single discipline action this weekend. To start off, we had another of those hidden meets that wasn't on the NCAA schedule between Lynchburg at Sweetbriar. Neither team felt the need to put this on the calendar, so I was not able to give you a prediction. Here's how it actually went. Sweetbriar won fences 3-2, and Lynchburg won flat 3-2, so that's a 5-5 tie for all you Alabama fans that might be listening. And that means we go to a tiebreaker, and Sweetbriar wins the tiebreaker 733 to 681. So kind of close, but nice big win for Sweetbriar. This kind of makes up for that tiebreaker road loss that they suffered at Dartmouth a few weeks ago. This was kind of a big loss for Lynchburg. They almost had the win, but they got a 0 on the flat, and that kind of killed their chances in the tiebreaker. So there you go. Also, Sweetbriar, you had a blank in a score sheet where oh my goodness, yeah, you had lots of blanks. So every time there's a 0 or should be a 0, you didn't put anything, so you left it blank. So you got 10 points worth of deductions on this. And what this meant was, I actually went back and looked, and I said, wait a minute, I think Sweetbriar has hosted another meet. Did they do the same thing on that other score sheet and I just didn't see it? And sure enough, they had like a week 3 meet against Bridgewater, and they did the same darn thing, so they lost 10 points out of that one too. So yeah, Sweetbriar, you kind of fell down the golden score sheet standings. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so another thing is, I thought we were going to get a jumping seat only meet between Auburn and Berry College, because the Vikings have on their school schedule, not the NCAA schedule, but on the school schedule, that they have a meet at Auburn this weekend. And of course, the fact that it wasn't on the NCAA calendar is no surprise, because as we've covered, there have been lots of them that haven't been on there. But it turns out there was no meet. Instead, Barry's IHSA team had a horse show at Auburn, and they listed the IHS show on their NCAA meet schedule. And they shouldn't be doing that, but they're a new school, so we'll cut them some slack here. There is no college equestrian podcast that deals with the IHSA, so yeah, we're not even going to talk about that. So there was no meet. But you know who did have a jumping seat only meet? College of Charleston at South Carolina. Now, this one was on the schedule. I predicted that the Gamecocks would get at least 7 out of 8 or maybe 9 out of 10 of the points. And it ended up being a 6-2 meet for South Carolina. So the Cougars actually did a little bit better than predicted. The Gamecocks won fences 3-1 and they won flat 3-1. So yeah, even in the loss, this was good to see. College of Charleston, their first meet, they got some points and they looked pretty good. For South Carolina, nice win. It's not going to technically count because it was jump seat only. But I will say that on their score sheet, they did not list an MOP for fences. So that's a 2-point deduction on the score sheet. And we don't know for sure, but it was probably Jordan Allen who had a really good score on fences. So I think she was the MOP, but it didn't list that there was an MOP. So, oh well. We also had Bridgewater at Sacred Heart this weekend. I predicted Sacred Heart would win that by about 3 points. Sacred Heart ended up winning 7-2, so a little bit more. This was a weird one where it had 4 riders in fences and 5 riders on the flat. So, second time we've seen that this year. So I have coined a new term called a Mewtwo meet after the Pokemon character, because the bottom frame is larger than the top frame. And if you know anything about Pokemon, you got that reference. Nice win for Sacred Heart. They were ahead of Bridgewater in my rankings, so they should have won, and they did. So, yay rankings. For Bridgewater, they're going to get another chance the very next day at Dartmouth. So let's talk about that. Now, I thought Dartmouth would win by about 2. The final score ended up being Dartmouth 5, Bridgewater 2. So a little bit more than 2. 3. That's a little bit more. Fences was a 2-2 tie, and flat went 3-1 for Dartmouth. So this was actually a good meet for both teams. Bridgewater did really well on the road, even though they lost. But a good job for Dartmouth. They got that home win just like they wanted. I will say their score sheet had some missing event totals stuff, so they pick up a deduction on that. But that was all of the weekend's action. And with that, I talked about a lot of imperfect score sheets that we had, a lot of deductions. So let's take a detailed look at this week's current Golden Score Sheet Awards. The Golden Score Sheet Award is a competition where each week I review all of the official score sheets, and sometimes I go back in the past and review ones that I've reviewed before but missed some things, and I award deductions and bonus points based on the number of errors that I find. Or I will award bonuses if you put the home team on the right, like you should be doing. Nobody has taken me up on that. Oh well. Every team begins the season with 100 points, and at the end of the season, the team or teams with the highest point totals will win an actual award from me commemorating their achievements in outstanding records keeping. So, here we go. In first place with a perfect 100 points are Berry College, Bridgewater, College of Charleston, Lynchburg, Minnesota Crookston, Sacred Heart, Swanee, SMU, and UC Davis. Now, keep in mind, some of these schools may end up not having any home meets. In the event of that, they will be removed from the standings once all that becomes official. So now we go down to 10th place with a score of 99 points are Dartmouth, Fresno State, Georgia, Oklahoma State, and TCU. In 15th place with a score of 98 is Baylor. In 16th place with a score of 97 are Texas A&M and UT Martin. In 18th place with a score of 96 are Auburn and Delaware State. In 20th place with a score of 92 is South Dakota State. In 21st place with a score of 93 is South Carolina. And in 22nd place with a score of 80 is Sweetbriar. So Sweetbriar took a ton of deductions this week. They should have had some back in week 3 that I missed. I caught them. They're factored in. But yeah, you can't leave that many blanks. You got to put a 0 in there. A blank is not the same as a 0. So that's why you've lost so many points here. But yeah, 9 teams are still perfect. We'll see how this ends up. And with all of this week's action, let's jump on over to the official Auburn Elvis College Equestrian Rankings. Now, things kind of went as expected in the dual discipline world, so there are no changes. I know Baylor was probably hoping that with their first win, that would be enough to get them up into the rankings, but beating Fresno State at home just isn't as impressive as it used to be, at least not right now. Plus, UC Davis went on the road. They got a pair of wins. Granted, the competition probably wasn't any better than Fresno State, but even still, I'm not going to put Baylor against UC Davis or UT Martin right now. But we're only 2 weeks away from all that working itself out anyway, because they'll play one another. So I have no issue leaving things as they are. And here is how they are. At number 1 is TCU. The Horned Frogs have gotten through the toughest part of their schedule undefeated, so they will probably stay here for the rest of the regular season. Number 2 is Auburn. The Tigers have looked great at home and decent on the road, but this week may damage their spotless record. Number 3 is SMU. The Mustangs barely beat A&M at home, so they sit at number 3. Number 4 is Texas A&M. The Aggies are here because of that SMU loss, but they have a chance to move up depending on how they, Auburn, and SMU do against each other this weekend. Now, number 5 is Georgia. The Bulldogs can win at home, but they haven't looked great on the road so far. Number 6 is Oklahoma State. Yeehaw! The Cowgirls are about the same as Georgia, except that they did lose at home to TCU. Number 7 is South Carolina. The Gamecocks are last in the SEC right now, but that's still better than half the teams out there. Number 8 is Delaware State. The stats say the Hornets are for real, and in 2 weeks we're going to find out if that is for real. Number 9 is UC Davis. Hello, you. The Aggies picked up a pair of wins away from home against overmatched conference foes. Number 10 is UT Martin. The Skyhawks have ridden against the best in the nation for most of the fall, but from here on out, the schedule is going to get a little easier. And as for the other teams, like I said, Fresno State, Baylor, you've got some work to do. Now, the single discipline rankings are where all the excitement was this weekend. That Sweetbriar win over Lynchburg created a circular argument where the Vixens are better than the Hornets, who are better than the Green, who are better than the Vixens. So, to resolve this, I looked at the wins among each team, among each other, and Lynchburg won at Dartmouth, whereas Sweetbriar won at home, and Dartmouth won at home. So, the number one team is Lynchburg. Winning on the road is the difference between a good team and a great team, and the Hornets are just a little better than everyone else right now. Number 2 is Sweetbriar. The Vixens took down Lynchburg at home, and that makes up for their loss last week at Dartmouth. Number 3 is Dartmouth. The Big Green are right behind Sweetbriar, mainly because when they hosted Lynchburg, they kind of got handled. Number 4 is Sacred Heart. The Pioneers picked up a win over Bridgewater and improved their stats enough to rise to number 4 right now. Number 5 is Berry College. The Vikings still have not ridden an NCEA meet this season, so that's kind of letting other teams move around them. Number 6 is Bridgewater. Bridgewater has performed about as expected, but they'll really need to get some wins if they want to hopefully make it to Ocala in April. Number 7 is College of Charleston. The Cougars had a meet, and while they lost, they still got a few points, and they did enough to move above the number 8 team. And that number 8 team is Sewanee. The Tigers have not ridden yet, and with so much turnover on the roster from last year, the stats now say that they're probably the number 8 team in the nation. But don't worry, Sewanee fans, this week your team is about to ride. So, let's take a look at our upcoming meet previews. First, we're going to take a look at Sewanee at Sweetbriar. I don't hold out much hope for the Tigers going on the road to Sweetbriar. I kind of think this one is either going to be 8-0 or 10-0 in favor of Sweetbriar, depending on how many riders there are in the meet. Next, we have Dartmouth at Sweetbriar. Now, the schedule says Dartmouth will be at Sweetbriar this week, but I think that's incorrect. They also have a home meet on Sunday, and it's very rare to travel and have a home meet in the same weekend. So I've got it listed here because it is on the official calendar. But again, I think this is another case where that NCAA schedule is wrong. Next, we have a big one, Auburn at Texas A&M. So this is what all the Auburn fans have been listening to the podcast to get to. We're here now. Let's look at how this one should go. In fences, I think Auburn wins either 3-2 or maybe 4-1, so a good start there. On the flat, I think the teams are dead even, but with Auburn being on the road, they're not as ferocious as they are at home, so I think A&M will probably take the flat 3-2. On we go to horsemanship. Auburn has the advantage and should win 3-2. That leaves reining. A&M is a little better there, so I think that goes 3-2 for the Aggies. Add all that up, and Auburn should squeak out a 10-10 tiebreaker or maybe an 11-9 win, but it should be very close. So this is a big time meet here, and that's what you kind of expect. The next meet to look at, Baylor at TCU. Baylor has almost no chance of winning this. The Bears are going to have to load up on jumping seat points, and then they're going to have to steal some reigning points to win. And we've seen them have lots of trouble doing that sort of thing so far, so I think TCU wins this one probably 14-5. Over we go on to Saturday, where we have Sewanee at Lynchburg. After facing Sweetbriar, the Tigers are going to make the short road trip over to Lynchburg, but I don't think it's going to go any better. I think this is probably going to be another sweep, either 8-0 or 10-0, depending on the number of riders. Then we have Auburn at SMU. This will be another tough one for Auburn. I think fences goes 2-2. I think Auburn wins the flat 3-2. I think horsemanship is another 2-2 tie, And in reining, I think that is also a 2-2 tie. So again, I think Auburn looks better on paper and should get a win, and it'll be a close one, probably a score of 9-8. So very close. Then we finish up the weekend with Sacred Heart at Dartmouth College. And I give this one a little bit of an edge to Dartmouth. These two teams are pretty close. I think the Green are probably going to win by 2 points. And again, we don't know if it's going to be 4 riders or 5, but we'll just say Dartmouth gets a 2-point win. All right, those are all of our meets to preview. So when I close out, I usually have a soapbox issue. So let's have a little talk for a few minutes about getting the little details right, because it's not happening all the time here in the NCEA. Now, we all dream of a day when this sport is going to grow to those 50-member threshold, and then it becomes a full-on championship-level NCAA sport. But I'm here to tell you that the slipshod attention to detail that this league exhibits is going to make that day a little further away. I bet every coaching staff out there preaches the work that they do on the little things, the details, and I'm sure they all talk about how important it is to make sure the small things are done right, even if they're not critical or specifically necessary. And I'm here to tell you that from what I've seen, a lot of that is just talk, because there are lots and lots of little details that are getting missed. So why is this important? Well, most of the riders on these teams are going to go pro in something other than sports. So wouldn't you think teaching them lessons like accurately filling out forms of data and records is important? Because I work in an industry that uses a lot of data and forms, and it is very important to fill in all the blanks and forms. Many of these ladies, future bosses, are not going to accept that leaving a box blank is okay because, everybody can kind of tell what number should be there. That's not going to fly. Their bosses will not accept that. So why are you schools teaching your student athletes that this kind of thing is okay? And I'm talking to Auburn, Baylor, Dartmouth, Delaware State, Fresno State, Georgia, Oklahoma State, South Carolina, South Dakota State, Sweetbriar, Texas A&M, and UT Martin. I bet all of you claim to work on the small details, but you are in fact teaching your student athletes that it's okay to turn in incomplete work to their future bosses. Or let's talk about the NCEA schedule. Now, I've heard that each team is responsible for making sure their schedule on that NCAA website is uploaded and accurate. So that means that if a meet is not on there, both teams are to blame, because that means neither one of them made sure that all their meets are listed correctly. So do you think that the schools would think that, a future boss of some of these student athletes is going to be okay if maybe these ladies just don't enter in a scheduled event into the company calendar someday, and then they'll rationalize it by saying, well, all the important people who are going to go to this event, they already know about it, so it's okay if it's not on the official company schedule. No, I just don't think their bosses are going to accept that. So schools like Bridgewater, Sweetbriar, South Carolina, Georgia, Swanee, Lynchburg, Dartmouth, you're teaching your student athletes that it's okay not to keep an accurate calendar for their bosses someday. Why would you do that? So I've called out a bunch of teams here, deservedly so, but this doesn't have to be the end of it. All of these errors are fixable, but these teams are going to have to do a better job of attending to these small details. Now, I don't know how many coaches listen to this podcast, but I know a lot of riders do, so here's what I say to you. If I called out your team today, or even if I didn't call them out, you could still have an impact on making sure that these small details don't continue to get overlooked. For something like the NCAA schedule, maybe take the initiative, go to a coach and say something like, hey, I've heard that there might be some meets missing from the NCAA calendar. I have about 20 minutes. Could I sit down and maybe double check all the meets on our calendar and just make sure that if there are any missing, then, you could log in and we could make sure those get added. Or maybe you could go up to a coach and say, hey, I hear some of the score sheets have some blanks in them with, missing zeros and things like that. I could spend some time at the end of a meet and just double check everything, that it makes sure that it's all filled out in the score sheet. And I bet many of your coaches would be absolutely floored if a rider came up and offered to help them with some of these little pesky details. So, that's my soapbox issue this week. Let's all work a little harder to make sure that these little details get taken care of, because it's going to be important to do those types of things later in life, and it's important to make sure that they're done here now in this sport. Well, that's all for this episode. I am your host, Auburn Elvis. Thank you very much for listening, and war horses.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on the E2C Network. On your way out, I want to remind you to stop by e2cnetwork.com. It's your one-stop shop for all our content across our podcast, YouTube channel, and much more. To stay up to date with us, make sure you're following social media accounts such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. While our content here may always be Auburn sports heavy, if it's orange and blue, it's what we do. War Eagle.